So, welcome to the podcast, Trends Literature Series. Today, I'm incredibly excited. I'm excited about my guest. I'm excited about the book that we are going to discuss. And the book's name is The Night Diary. The book was introduced to me in my book club, and I was totally fascinated. I was feeling like, why didn't I know about this book earlier? So, already 3 months into first knowing about the book, and here I am. We have already have had several discussions on this, and we are so privileged to have Veera Hiranandani with us today. She's a multiple award-winning author, master storyteller, creative writing teacher. I mean, she's joining all the way from Connecticut, if I'm not wrong. That's where you're
New
joining
York,
from.
New York.
Okay. And she's a celebrated author whose work explores themes of identity, belonging, and history with emotional depth and grace. So, a little bit about the book that we're going to talk about. This is The Night Diary. It was first published in 2018 by Penguin, and it has really captivated readers for years now, particularly because of its poignant portrayal of the 1947 partition of India. It navigates a world torn by division. I'm just reading this out, and violence and heartbreak of leaving behind everything familiar and, of course, fear of unknown. So, welcome, Veera. Such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here. So I'm glad I can.
Okay. Veera, the Night Diary really explores a deeply emotional and historical moment. That is 1947. So, what really inspired you to tackle such a complex and very sensitive topic?
Yes, it was very many years in the making. And so my father's side of the family is originally from what is now Pakistan. So he grew up in Sindh, in Mir Prakash, and he was 9 during the partition. So he and my grandparents and his brothers and sisters, um, all had to leave and eventually they first went to Jodhpur and then they ended up in um, Mumbai. And so I grew up, and then my father with his brothers, came to the US in his 20s. And eventually met my mom, who's not Indian. She grew up in the New York area. She's Jewish. And they met and got married and settled in Connecticut. And so that's where I grew up with my sister. And so I would hear stories about the partition, but sort of in these bits and pieces from my aunts and uncles, at family gatherings. Once in a while, it would come up and they would talk about this time that was hard and scary and they had to leave and start over. And I just thought it was something that this like hard, difficult time that happened to my family, my grandparents and my aunts and uncles. I didn't really understand the global magnitude of what they were even talking about. But really, the first time that I understood it was when the movie Gandhi came out. And I was 11 when that movie came out. So we all went to see it. And, of course, it's a big Hollywood depiction of Gandhi's life and partition. But it was the first time I understood what that word even meant, what had happened, all of the sadness and the loss and the violence that happened, and I was just sort of shocked that this is what my father's family went through. So I think I carried that with me. I didn't know I'd grow up to be a writer, but when I did, I thought it was really important to, as sort of the next generation of partition survivors, to try to capture this history in some way, particularly for young people. Because, and in the US, because I feel like most people, didn't learn about the partition. Maybe they heard something about India's independence and then, it split into two countries and that's it. So that's what inspired me.
Fantastic. And the unique format of the book. You've written the story of the protagonist, which is a little fictionalized, but yes, I mean, more to do with the how your family went through the entire partition days and how they walked across and everything. But it's a unique format. You wrote it in the form of letters. And that is very, very interesting because it creates an intimate and very, very powerful connection between the readers and the protagonist. So why did you choose this format? So how did you really thought about choosing this
Yeah.
particular format, though it is through the eyes of a 12-year-old Nisha, but it is such a strong book. So
Well, thank you.
yeah.
Um, I was just experimenting. I often start every book project thinking about the first choices I make. Well, the first choice I usually make is the setting. Where is this story going to take place and what am I drawing from? And I do write um some other historical fiction that takes place. I've continued this story in the Night Diary with another book, a companion novel. But I'm often thinking about the setting and then who's going to be the main character. And I actually started the Night Diary with a male main character, kind of like a fictionalized version of my father. And as I started writing, I felt like I was also doing a lot of research and trying to learn as much about as many different experiences during the partition as I could, not just my own family's experience. And I felt a little boxed in by my family's story, and I couldn't sort of draw from other places because I had this idea, well, that's not what happened to my family and my father. And so I needed to sort of free myself from that. And I kind of moved that male character over, and he sort of became Nisha's twin brother, Emil. And then Nisha came to me very quiet and somebody who was very shy and kind of this a complex thinker, but had trouble speaking to people outside of her family and kind of in public spaces. And so I thought she'd write a diary and she would feel very free in her diary to express everything that was going on and everything that she was thinking. And we would see that contrast of who she was in her life outside of her kind of private space and then who she was in the diary. So I started writing it that way.
Yes.
But then she was just doing entries, but there wasn't something like kind of moving the story forward. I knew that her mother wasn't alive anymore. I wanted to write about an interfaith family. And so I thought maybe she's writing to her Muslim mother about what's happening. And that clicked. And then the
Mhm.
story just kind of took off from there. So a long process.
I know it's been a long process, definitely. And even though you've written it through the eyes of a 12-year-old, but I think it resonates with the entire, all the age groups. And in the book, the protagonist, she writes letters, as you just mentioned, to her deceased Muslim mother, maybe in a way to process her emotions also, because that's what she did finally. But how did you approach writing these letters in a way that felt very, very authentic to her age? I'm sure
Mm.
it's, I know you are a children's literature writer, but how did you like, and you're being a creative writer, professional, writing professional, but how did you really write in a way that it felt authentic to her age as well, and the gravity of the entire historical event? That is such a beauty of this book, how you've got into her shoes and written it.
Well, thank you.
Mm.
Um, I feel like somehow that 11, 12-year-old narrator, it's something that I can channel more easily than even somebody a character that was younger or a character who's older, like a older teen or an adult. And my first book was also a 12-year-old narrator. And so middle grade, which is, the kind of the category that this all fits in, although I say that my books are from ages 9 to 99,
Mm.
anybody can read them. I feel like becoming that 12-year-old is not that difficult for me because that was a time in my life where I was kind of going through a lot of changes. I had switched schools in Connecticut. I didn't feel that comfortable at my new school. I went to a very small school in the beginning and everybody knew each other. And it was just like an extended family. And then I went to a bigger um, school, my town's public school. And suddenly my identity came up in ways that surprised me once I switched schools and people were asking me about my name. Nobody could pronounce it. There were like no South Asian kids in my school, no Jewish kids in my school, a few. And certainly nobody that had both backgrounds in their family. And suddenly I felt very different and very sort of other. And it was a difficult time for me to adjust and kind of confront some of those feelings. My first book is about a lot about some of those experiences, and I kind of used that for my first
It's a
novel.
semi-autobiographical, as I
Yes,
uh,
semi-autobiography. Definitely, there are things that happen that I fictionalized, but
yes,
I use kind of that essence in my
yeah.
first novel. So I feel like because it was a difficult time, those memories are very clear. And I just remember being that age so well. And it's not that difficult to me, even in a setting that I haven't experienced personally, to imagine what a 12-year-old might feel like in any setting that I'm researching and thinking about.
Nisha's journey, I would say, is also filled with some loss, some uncertainty. But were there any moments in her story when you personally, as an author, really found particularly heartbreaking? I mean,
Yeah.
you were sketching that character, you were writing from some experiences that have been told to you, but something which you really found very, very heartbreaking from your perspective too, which also surprised you.
Yeah, it was really difficult for me. First of all, some of the research about partition. It's just such a difficult period of history to research deeply because there are many stories that were so upsetting, so confusing, so violent, so sad. And there were times even during my research where I had to just take a break, things that I weren't even planning to include in the book. Um, so it was hard just taking that all in. And there are times where I did show some violence and some hard things that, I wanted to be appropriate for a young reader where they could kind of manage and handle, but at the same time understand the truth of what happened, and how vulnerable people were, and how people were experiencing kind of loss on both sides in a very similar way. And so, like, for example, when they run out of water when they're walking across the desert, and their lives are at
Yes,
stake, and
yes.
it's a child, so it was really hard to write those scenes. And I wanted to, again, I'm a parent, so there was like that protective sense of like, I don't want to show too much or make it too scary, but I want it to be truthful to what could have happened. I'm also feeling my own emotions while I'm writing, so yeah, those times were difficult, and I just sort of pushed through it. And often when I write a draft, I just kind of push through it. I try not to second guess myself too much because I know I'm going to revise it a million times. So it was constantly sort of taking things in, taking things out, putting things back to just try to hit the right note.
No, no, you're so right, because your feelings come through. And the fact that how you made the children's literature, some of the adult topics actually accessible to children. I think that is the beauty of the book. It's an adult topic in a way that it's not really expected that a 12-year-old will feel the way it is, but the way you've portrayed the entire thing and made it accessible, the children's literature, that's why I think it's got a universal appeal that everyone can read it and still think. Initially, when it was recommended to me, somebody said it's from age group 8 to 12. And I was thinking, why am I ordering this book? But then I realized, and I really thank the person who really kind of recommended this in our club. Then I realized, no, it's much more than this. And then I read about you, I read about the whole background, and it really comes through. But one thing, because you combined the personal stories with the larger historical context of the
Right.
partition. So, how did you really balance the two? I know you've been talking about it, but then you had this story in your mind, and the historical context is so important, and so was the personal. So, how did you really balance these two? Because I'm sure the balancing part would have been very difficult for you, but you had to keep still the narrative alive.
Yeah. Yeah. You mean balancing sort of my own family history with my research?
Research, yeah, and also the fact that we're looking at a broader context, a real story. So it was all coming into place. So how did you
Yeah.
do that? What was your process of doing this?
First it is really just kind of sketching out the story. This is how I see the story. This is the general setting, the characters, the beginning, the middle, the end, um, based on, what I'm kind of sort of representing in some ways a more universal partition story. In other ways, I'm trying to capture a very specific story because I certainly don't want to be, and I shouldn't be, the partition story in that sense. Like, especially in the US, there aren't a lot of stories about partition for young people. So I knew I might be one of the first people in kind of the contemporary world um, doing this for middle grade fiction. So I wanted to, again, kind of mix and match a little bit. This isn't necessarily completely accurate to the Sindhi Hindu story in the sense that my own family left later. They didn't leave right after partition. The sort of unrest that was happening took a longer time to kind of bubble up. And eventually, when my grandparents left, my grandfather actually stayed, and my grandmother left with the kids and a cousin of hers. Because my grandfather was a doctor at the Mirpurkhas City Hospital and they didn't want him to leave. And eventually he ended up leaving like in the night about a month later by himself. So, there were things that I felt were very specific to that story, but maybe weren't going to portray the more universal partition story. And so I was mixing and matching some research to just sort of give that sense of what happened to a lot of people. But then of course there's a million specific stories, and there are people coming from different directions, and of course everybody who went into Pakistan, or people in southern India, there are all these different kinds of stories, or Bangladesh. So I just, decided that this was the way to kind of portray it in the way that I saw it and the questions that I wanted to ask. And that's all you can really do as an author. And then you hope that there are a million stories of people expressing their views and their specific experiences or their family history.
You've been to India? You visit India quite
Yes,
often?
a few
So have you
times,
been?
not
You've been
not
to
enough.
Amritsar? Amritsar?
No, I haven't, and that
Oh, they
is
have a
definitely.
beautiful partition
No,
museum there, and I think you
I
must
know.
visit.
And somebody took a picture of my book holding it there. That was like incredible. So that is on my list. I might be going this fall to Bangalore for a children's book
Mm.
festival.
Okay.
Um
So you
yeah.
must visit Amritsar, because this is how it happened with me in sequence. I went to Amritsar first. I saw the Partition Museum, came back, and this book was recommended. So it all fell in place. So I was
Okay.
thinking
Yes,
recently that I definitely ask you about if you've been to Amritsar and seen that beautiful museum that they've made there.
I have
Wonderful.
to.
And your book talks so strongly about the family bond in those harrowing circumstances. That is one of the most high points of the book that I really realize. As you just mentioned about the water thing, there were so many circumstances. So, how did you feel writing that? So, you were all nostalgic when you were writing about family bonding and how in India it is so cherished, the closeness, and you can do anything for the other person in the family. And it really comes through in your book.
Thank you. I'm very close to my family and my extended family on both sides and my cousins, and that was a very important part of my childhood and growing up. And I also, what I love to, I try to do it in a lot of my stories, is portray all of the characters in the story, the young people and the often the parent characters or other adults in the child's life, as human beings, flawed human beings. And I think that especially during that age, that kind of middle school age, is when you as a young person may start to understand that your parents are flawed and just human beings struggling through life just the way you are. And certainly in any kind of crisis, you're going to see that even more. And so I think Nisha has to kind of understand her father and her grandmother as also just people who are trying to do their best in the moment, and they're not always going to make the right decisions, or they are going to kind of let down some of their role and just try to connect to their own children as people. So she starts to see her father, who can be kind of this intimidating character, who he's very responsible and he works hard and he wants to protect his family, but he's not always, the most emotionally available person. And how she sees him eventually as just a human being, and they connect in ways and that he sees her
Mm.
as a human being, not just his daughter that he's supposed to protect, and they can kind of eventually connect that way over time. And I think about the way my father talks about his parents, and how, there were times where he felt like that emotional distance with them, the more formal parent child relationships that they had. And then there were times that I felt that way about my father, where we're very close now, but when I was young, he was kind of this, businessman, and he came home in his suit and, wanted my grades to be good. And I didn't always feel kind of emotionally connected that way. So I was kind of working out all of those feelings.
Talking to you, I can see the kind of, it would have taken a lot of toll on you while writing this book. I mean, the research, the personal feelings coming in, and when you talk still after so many years of it being published, I'm sure it looks as if it was yesterday that but I was just thinking, I mean, while talking to you just now, I mean, it took so much out of you, this book. And then you also decide to have a sequel. So, how did you kind of get yourself again together and said, okay, I'll write now, Amil and After Now, about the central protagonist being Nisha's brother. So, how did it happen? I mean, I'm sure you had to really get yourself together to write because so much of you is in the Night Diary. How do you get the courage to write a sequel?
I really miss the family, and
Okay.
here I'll show I have,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, I have to
um,
still read the book. This is the first one,
it's
Night
the first.
Diary. Great.
So because the Night Diary was, popular, it won a Newbery honor, I got the chance to visit a lot of schools
Mm.
around the country and India. In Bangalore, I went to the Neve Children's Literature Festival and talked about that book in 2019. So I was talking about the book all the time. I continued to do podcasts and interviews about the Night Diary. I just can't believe that it has had the success it's had, and so many people have been interested in the story and why I wrote it. And so because I spent a year talking about it so much, I just started to think about the characters and kind of how they were doing. I miss them. I When I create characters, I it's such an intimate process that they really feel like they live somewhere in a parallel universe. I believe in their existence somehow. And so I miss them and I wanted to return. I also wanted to focus a little more on the Sindhi experience, and focus a little more on the India that I'm most familiar with. So eventually, my father, they were in Jodhpur for about 2 years and then they went to Bombay, and that's where I've visited, and I've seen the apartment that my father grew up when he was like 11 until in his 20s. And that's the city I know best in India. And so I wanted to set something there. I wanted to follow the family. I wanted to capture that experience of people coming from Sindh and the community in Mumbai, the Sindhi community in Mumbai. So, and then also a lot of kids were saying, we'd love a sequel and we want it in Emil's perspective. We want to know what he thinks. And I thought, that's a great idea. So I kind of moved the story to his perspective, but not in a diary format. So I wanted to also do something different and kind of freshen up the story, have another point of view. And so Emil shares his drawings. He wouldn't be the type to write a diary. Writing is actually hard for him. I don't label it in the book, but he has dyslexia. But he doesn't really understand that he does, because during the partition in 1947, 48, he wouldn't necessarily have that label to work with. So he just thinks he's kind of that he's just not good at writing, and that's Nisha's thing, but he can draw and he loves drawing. And so he draws as part of this drawing journal to his mother in the same way that Nisha wrote a diary to her mother to kind of express how they're rebuilding their lives. And the other reason I wanted to write the sequel is because I was kind of channeling what we went through during the pandemic and that sort of fallout after the immediate crisis is over. And then, what are we left with? How do we, if we're lucky enough to survive a difficult experience, how do we rebuild our lives? What happens after? And so that's what I wanted to focus on, how partition survivors did rebuild their lives and what were they kind of, how were they wounded and how are they strengthened by what they went through.
Fantastic. It sounds and looks quite something that I'll definitely be reading very, very shortly. But people who are reading Amal and After, are they ones who've already read the Night Diary, or they are going back to the Night Diary and reading that as well? So how's it going? How's the response?
Good. I think there are people that are sometimes read it without reading the Night Diary. I know some people who've read it in reverse, which I think is really interesting. I do a little bit of a summary in the beginning, so you can read it without reading the Night Diary and you'll have a sense of what's going on. I do think it's a richer experience to read, the Night Diary first and Meal and the After. Um, but I I've seen all combinations and it was a closure I needed. I don't think I will revisit it anymore. I think I've kind of finished what I needed to do. Um, but I think I just wasn't quite finished with the story. So
Fantastic. You know, identity and belonging, they've been very, very important themes that you've covered that resonates very deeply in Night Diary, and I'm sure it now resonates very deeply in Amal and After as well. But how do you hope that readers, especially children who are staying outside, and particularly the young ones, they relate to Nisha's struggles with these issues, their own lives? I'm sure this book helps in certain way with this issue as well. But how do you think? Because I think they've been center themes in your books.
yeah. There are times where I've felt different in my life, in my community, and I think that sometimes that experience can kind of leave you with a certain sense of being able to observe things around you more. If you're not always feeling like you're in the center of things, you can kind of stand back. And I was a shy kid too. I was definitely, Nisha has, she's a little shyer than I was, but I was not, I was a kid in the back of the class hoping the teacher wouldn't call on me kind of thing. But then what that does is it turns you into an observer. And when you are more of an observer, at least I did, I started to question pretty young what was going on around me and why my identity was treated the way it was in two different schools and why it was even kind of a big deal anyway. Um, and then I saw, the way certain groups of kids treated each other because of that kind of observer status. And I took in the way people can really divide themselves and can sort of push each other this way and that. And then, of course, partition, doing the research and the experience of, so many Hindu families, Muslim families, Sikh families, how similar the sense of loss and confusion was during the partition once the borders were drawn. Um, and then immediately people feeling, especially communities like Mir Prakash, where my dad
Hmm.
talks about how there was a lot of acceptance and respect for many different groups of people and many different religions. And then the partition, just not that there weren't any conflicts before, but it elevated it to such a level that I can see happening in the US, politically, and there's just so many, and of course India. Um, there are just so many ways that we can kind of completely push each other to our corners, forgetting what's underneath. So I think Papa, because he's a doctor, he talks a lot about what's underneath what's in our bodies, um, is all the same, that he's, treating bodies, human beings. And it doesn't matter what group you're in. If you're sick, you just need somebody to understand the body. And
Was it
so,
a conscious decision to kind of just coming another part of the question that that the children are like half Muslim and half Hindu, right? So
right.
I know it kind of gives another perspective to the book altogether. So was it consciously done, or you felt that I think maybe it'll make the understanding of the partition even better? Because where do I mean, the children are constantly questioning. I mean, what is their fault? Their
Yeah.
parents are, yeah, you would like to elaborate on
Yeah.
this?
um I because I come from an interfaith family, even though I didn't have the stakes around that identity in the way Nisha and Emil would have during the partition. um you tend to feel, how do I kind of take in both of these identities, and make them sort of one whole thing within
Mm,
me. And I also wanted them, so there was the personal experience of just navigating multiple identities, whether you're biracial, from an interfaith family, both, and what that feels like. And then also think about the partition and two kids who are connected to both sides in that way. Where do they constantly are asking, what does this mean? Where do I
mm,
belong? How do I stay close to my Muslim mother who's no longer living in this context? And part of the reason that she's not living is because that would be a different kind of story. And I still wanted to follow kind of the path that a Hindu family would take during the partition, because that's what I was most familiar with. And I didn't feel comfortable kind of stepping into like an entirely different um, identity for that. So that's part of why I did what I did, but I definitely wanted to kind of and explore the questions through that interfaith lens.
yeah, very intense, I must say, and a lot of deep meaning. And definitely, I read one of your articles in which you talk about you've written about our broken world for young people, and from a historical perspective, and you've dealt with that very well in the book. It's kind of a broken world for them. They don't understand. It's getting fragmented all over. So, do you think this is important for children to know about this aspect as well? That's why perhaps your literature, as I just mentioned, about the accessibility to the young readers, about some very adult topics. And do you intend to cover other topics, similar topics in future, maybe different parts of the world with so much going on in the current history that we are in, the current scene that we are in? So does that also make you think that maybe perhaps I'll do something else now and go over to the other topics which really, really concern children? What is happening
Yeah.
maybe in Palestine or elsewhere? I mean, yeah.
Yes. I can only enter topics that I have some kind of personal connection to. That's what I need to do as a writer. Um, Sometimes people can like sort of find something that's just fascinating or interesting, or something that needs to be explored, but for me I need to enter it in a really personal way. So I wrote a book between these two books called How to Find What You're Not Looking For, and that takes place in the 1960s in the US, through the eyes of a 12-year-old Jewish girl whose older sister falls in love with an Indian college student, and they, in the very beginning, kind of run off because they want to get married. And so Ariel is kind of watching this happen with her older sister, and then her Jewish parents, how they are reacting to this. And then we also get to know the Indian family and how they're reacting. And it's definitely taken from some of the things that my parents went through when they decided to get married in 1968. And so I was kind of, looking at all of the historical things that were going on in the U.S. at that time, in the civil rights era, and and this is right after the Loving ruling, the Supreme Court Loving ruling that banned any laws against interracial marriage. And so my parents got married a year after that, the Loving ruling in Connecticut, where it was legal for them to get married anyway. But there were 15 states where it potentially wasn't. And only a year before they got married. So I wanted to kind of explore some of those ideas. So that's one example of kind of using, different, a different context, different area of history. And so I think I'll always be kind of thinking about how I can do that, whether but it still has to be inspired by not necessarily directly my family history, because I'll eventually run run
Um,
out of specific ideas, but trying to see, what I can kind of use and then how it can comment on contemporary life, because that's the thing. When anything I write about, I just start to see all of these echoes in the modern world of something that happened 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And that makes me sad, actually, that a lot of the conflicts that we have are just still manifesting in different ways. And we'd like to think that if we learn about history, we don't repeat the same mistakes, and yet here we are. So
yeah, different times, different mistakes, and different
yeah.
learnings all the time. One thing I have to tell my viewers, and they'll ultimately be seeing this on our YouTube channel, that of course you are such an expert on creative writing. So I cannot let you go without telling our viewers there's so many prospective, people who want to be authors, they also watch our programs, people who want to read, they'll be reading your book, of course. But maybe any special tips for the young writers, somebody who wants to write a new book, and how do they begin, or perhaps some tips. Definitely they would really expect that you tell them this because they know about your history now.
Yeah. Well, I teach writing at a college called the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and it's an MFA program, a low residency MFA program. So you only have to be kind of in person. And we also have cloud residencies twice a year. So in January and
Okay.
in July. So that's for any international students. They can do it online. But one of the things that I always say to people, and a lot of writing authors and writing teachers say, is, read as much as you can and write as much as you can, and nothing is ever wasted. If let's say you write a stack of novels that you never publish, and then eventually you publish something, that stack of drafts or books that you just don't feel you're going to try to get published, or you can't, you've sent it out and it's not happening, but then eventually something happens, none of that was wasted. It's deep practice. And so every word you write in that attempt to be a writer is always useful. It is never a waste of your time. So I would say that.
That's a very important tip. And when do you think one is ready to be published? I know you've just said that it never goes wasting, but when is the time that you feel that yes, now you should go to a publisher? How many
Yeah.
times you see the draft again and again? What does one do? What is the process like?
Well, it's good to have some other trusted readers, after, because I need my editor. I have some writing friends I give work to, because you're so close to it. And it's really hard to kind of see your own work after a while. So I think getting some trusted readers to give you some feedback, that have your best interest in mind, that you feel comfortable with the feedback. So that's definitely the first step, to have some readers and understand that the process does take a lot of revision. So even if you send it out to an agent, that's usually the first step in the US. You send it out to an agent, and then if you get represented by an agent, then they send your work out to publishers. And then if you get lucky, you only need one yes. So if you get a bite, and you get a yes, you're going to have to go through more revision with that editor. So the idea of having to revise or getting feedback doesn't mean that your work is flawed. It's very much a part of the process, but it's also about looking at agents. If you have something that you've done the revision and you've sent it out to trusted readers, and you feel like you have something that's ready to be sent out, to research agents online. There are plenty of resources of lists of agents and what they're looking for. Do your homework, see, is this agent representing work like mine? And being able to target that as you send your book out for representation.
Fantastic. I can keep on listening to you, but we have a little bit of a time constraint, and it's been such a wonderful session with you. But some last words on your book, The Night Diary and A Million After. Anything that
Um,
you'd like to mention on both the books, and especially about A Million After, definitely.
yeah, well, that came out it's been out for a year.
Okay.
And I think more and more people are finding out about it. Publishing moves sort of slowly.
Hmm.
So I think it's kind of slowly getting on the radar of more and more people and more Night Diary fans. So I really, hope people check it out. And I'm also just really grateful that people read these books at all, and that you would contact me from India and say I'm reading this book in my book club. So that just means so much to me. So I'm just grateful for each and every reader every time.
Thank you so much, Veera, for being on our platform. We've been wanting to do this for a long time, and I'm so happy that finally we could do this today. And thank you, and hope to see you when you come to India, or likewise, if I'm in US, definitely try to meet you. But
Yeah.
many, many wishes for the books. The more and more books you write, the more and more such lovely literature we get to read. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you everyone for joining in. Please do subscribe to our channel so that more and more people can see such wonderful interactions like the one that we had today. Thank you. Thank you so much.